From the first moment it happened, from the second she heard the crack of his palm against her cheek echo through the cold hallway of the base cafeteria, every eye turned toward them, and silence rolled across the room like a wave swallowing air itself. It happened so fast that the world seemed to freeze. One heartbeat, she was standing there trying to explain herself with trembling hands, the next, she was stumbling backward, gripping the railing for balance as the force of the slap burned hot against her skin. And while she fought to steady her breath, he stood there laughing. Shallow, mocking, cruel laughter that bounced off the steel walls like a slap of its own. No one moved at first. No chairs shifted. No plates clattered. The Marines of the mess hall, men and women who had seen war, who had carried brothers off battlefields and patched wounds under fire, sat frozen, watching a scene none of them expected to witness within the safety of their own walls. And in that stillness, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, was the beginning of a story none of them would ever forget. Her name was Elena Hart, the soft-spoken wife of Lance Corporal Mason Hart, a man known in training reports for discipline but known in private for a temper that simmered beneath the surface like a volatile fault line. Elena had always been gentle, the kind of soul who apologized when someone else stepped on her foot. She wasn't loud or bold or confrontational. She preferred quiet afternoons, warm kitchens, the smell of books, and the comfort of people who loved without condition. But life had brought her here, far from her hometown, far from familiarity, into a world of regimented order and unspoken expectations. She had learned early on that military families were judged silently, always watched, always measured. And Mason used that pressure against her like a weapon. For months he had chipped away at her confidence, turning every mistake into a storm. He told her she embarrassed him, that she made him look weak, that she didn't understand the way things worked here. He controlled her words, her movements, even her breath sometimes. And she endured it quietly because she thought love was supposed to hurt sometimes, because she believed all people had shadows and monstrous days, because she feared that speaking up would only paint her as a burden. She didn't know that the bruise on her arm, hidden beneath her sleeves, was speaking louder than her silence ever could. That day, she had simply brought him lunch. Homemade, warm, carefully packed the way he once said he liked it. But he had wanted something else. Something she hadn't known. That was all it took. One misunderstanding, and suddenly his hand had struck her across the face with the weight of months of pent-up frustration. Elena gasped, not from pain, but from heartbreak. She could withstand hurt. What crushed her was the look in his eyes, cold, distant, amused, as if she were nothing more than a mistake in his way. And then came his laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't hysterical. It was far worse, a dismissive, belittling snicker, as if what he had done was normal, justified, insignificant. As if hitting her meant nothing. As if she meant nothing. She felt her world compress into a tight space, a suffocating fog where shame wrapped around her throat. She lowered her head, wishing she could disappear, wishing the eyes of 100 Marines weren't silently dissecting her life. But as the echo of his laugh faded, something else rose. It started with the faint scrape of a chair leg. A slow, deliberate movement that cut across the tension like a blade. Then another. And another. In the vast, cavernous mess hall, home to noise, banter, the metallic clatter of trays, silence reigned as every Marine in the room stood up. One by one, row by row, uniform by uniform, they rose with a gravity that made Mason's smirk crumble. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't chaos. It was a collective declaration etched in posture alone. A silent verdict from the brotherhood he thought would protect him. Elena didn't understand at first. She only felt eyes soften, felt empathy radiate toward her like warmth after a long winter. She saw the anger, not at her, never at her, but at the man who had dared bring violence to the doorstep of a community built on discipline, respect, and honor. Mason tried to speak, but his voice faltered against the weight of hundreds of unsaid words. He stood smaller somehow, shrinking under their gaze. And that was the moment he realized, Marines do not tolerate cowardice. Not on the battlefield. Not in their homes. Not in their halls. He attempted to walk away, but someone blocked him. Another Marine stepped forward, not to touch him, not to threaten him, but simply to take Elena's lunch container from her trembling hands. He set it down gently on a nearby table, and with a quiet nod, he guided her toward the exit. She felt her knees weaken, but he steadied her. Others moved aside, creating a clear path as if escorting a wounded soldier from danger. It wasn't pity, they looked at her with respect, the same respect they gave people who survived things quietly, who didn't scream for help, who didn't collapse even when the world tried to shatter them. Outside the hall, Elena finally breathed. Her chest shook as she exhaled months of fear in one trembling moment. She didn't cry, not yet, but her eyes burned with unshed tears that carried years of swallowed pain. The Marine who'd helped her didn't pry. He didn't ask questions or demand explanations. He simply stood near her, offering presence instead of pressure. Sometimes silence is the most powerful form of support. That day changed everything. The incident spread across the base not as gossip, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something unacceptable. Leadership took it seriously. Mason was questioned, and his behavior came under the harsh scrutiny of men and women trained to detect weakness of character, especially weakness that endangered others. Elena was offered resources, counseling, safety, options she never knew existed. For the first time, she didn't feel stuck. She didn't feel alone. The days that followed weren't easy. She struggled with guilt, with fear of what would happen next, with a lifetime of believing she shouldn't cause trouble. She questioned herself, wondering if she deserved to stand tall, wondering if leaving would make her a failure. But every time doubt crept in, she remembered the sound of chairs shifting and boots rising. She remembered the silence that had spoken louder than any words ever could. Those Marines had stood not just against Mason, but for her. That was the moment she began to believe she deserved better. Change came in small steps. She left the housing unit and stayed temporarily with a military family support group. She began attending counseling sessions where she learned that love never demands pain. She spoke to other spouses, some who had walked similar paths, some who helped her see her worth again. Slowly, like dawn breaking through a long night, pieces of herself returned. Months later, Elena filed for separation. It was one of the hardest decisions she ever made, but also one of the bravest. Mason faced disciplinary action, both for the act itself and for disregarding the core values of the Corps. The Marines who had witnessed that moment never forgot it, and never let him forget either. He had betrayed something sacred. And Elena had survived something heavy. The base mess hall wasn't the same afterward. Whenever the story resurfaced, people didn't speak of violence, they spoke of unity, of honor, of rising together to protect the vulnerable, even when the vulnerable didn't know how to ask. Elena's story spread quietly through military spouses' circles, offering strength to those who whispered their own stories behind closed doors. She became a symbol not of weakness, but of resilience, the woman who endured, who found courage, who learned to walk forward without fear. Years later, Elena stood in a small apartment of her own, sunlight pouring through clean windows, and realized her life had transformed completely. She was working again, painting again, laughing again, real laughter, not the kind that hid pain but the kind that came from healing. And every now and then, she would remember that day, that slap, that laugh, that hall full of Marines rising to their feet. And instead of breaking her, the memory filled her with strength. Because she knew that the world contained cruelty, but it also contained people who would rise for someone who couldn't stand alone. If this story touched your heart, please consider supporting the channel. Your encouragement helps bring more powerful, meaningful stories like this to life. Special request: comment below what part of Elena's journey moved you the most.